I chose a book for Black-Eyed Susan. It was still dark when Cora awoke. She looked across the prairie and saw her family's wagon glowing with lantern light. Yesterday, Paul pulled their wagon away from where the others circled for the night, but told 10-year-old Cora to stay with Uncle Lee. Cora ran through the tall grasses until she reached her wagon. Aunt Alma was inside holding a baby. Paul sat leaning against the wagon wheel, his head in his hands. Something was wrong. "Where's Ma?" Cora could barely squeak out the words. When Paul lifted his head, the lantern light fell across his face. Tears rolled down his cheeks. All he could do was shake his head and pulled Cora tight to his chest. When the sunlight lightened the sky, Cora and Paul stood beside a small hill. Others had already left the graveside to get ready to move on. "What about the baby?" Cora asked. "Aunt Alma can take care of her," said Paul. It was soon time to leave. Cora sat in the back of their wagon. Through her tears, she watched the wooden crosses on the hill become smaller and smaller until it disappeared, when she lay down and cried herself to sleep. The wagon bumped and jiggled across the prairie. Cora awoke when she felt its movement stop at noon. She climbed out and walked slowly toward Aunt Alma and Uncle Lee's wagon. "Do you want to hold her?" Aunt Alma asked. Cora sat down and Aunt Alma placed the baby in her arms. As Cora softly stroked the tussles of yellow hair on her sister's head, the baby opened her eyes. They were pitch black. That evening, Paul and Cora sat in the front of the fire. They could hear Aunt Alma singing quietly to the baby. "Paul," Cora said, "I have a good name for the baby." "What?" Paul asked. "Susan," Cora said. "She reminds me of Black-Eyed Susans." "That's a beautiful name," Paul said. "Your Ma would like that name too." "They were Ma's favorite flowers," said Cora, remembering how she had picked handfuls alongside the trail for her mother. The day rolled on just as the wagon train did. Cora helped Aunt Alma with Susan as much as possible, but one stormy day Cora sat alone in her own wagon. As rain pelted on the canvas, she pulled out her mother's sewing box. Thumbing through the scraps, there were many pieces she recognized. A piece from her grandma's apron, one from Grandpa's shirt, and another from Ma's favorite dress. Cora thought of the house that they had left in Missouri. Grandma on the porch, Grandpa leading the mules in the barn. She thought about Ma. Susan would never know any of them. She wouldn't even remember the trip to Oregon. Suddenly, Cora had an idea. Cora took the scissors and cut squares, triangles, and rectangles from the scraps. She arranged the shapes on the largest square, threaded and needle, and started sewing. When she was done, she held up the square and smiled, remembering the farmhouse back in Missouri. Across the prairie, Cora worked on different squares. She had a covered wagon, another a campfire with the cooking spider. Some had pictures of animals Cora saw along the way, prairie dogs peeking from other holes, buffalo, a coyote, a hawk. There was a square with the strangely shaped cliff called Chimney Rock, another showing a wagon crossing a river, and then mountains rising blue in the distance. One evening Paul came to Cora. His face was sad, his eyes tired, but put his arms around Cora, and without talking he walked away from the wagons. At last Paul broke the silence. "I've asked Aunt Alma and Uncle Lee to raise Susan," he said. "No," Cora stopped, turning his face to Father. "I can take care of her." "You're too young," Paul said. and a baby needs a mother. But you're going to California, Cora argued. We'll never see her again. Yes, I know. We've gone through South Pass, and tomorrow the train will divide up, Paul said. He sighed and shook his head. This isn't the way I wanted things to be, Cora, but it will be the best for Susan. Cora turned and ran as hard as she could, away from Paul, and away from the wagons, away from the baby, and finally east toward her home 1,000 miles away. Cora knew deep down Paul was trying to do what was best. Aunt Alma was already being a good mother to Susan, but Cora didn't know if she could stand watching them leave with Susan tomorrow. Suddenly she jumped up. Tomorrow, she said. I've only got till tomorrow. Cora reached into the wagon and grabbed the sewing box. She carefully embroidered a square until she was dotted with black-eyed Susans. Then she took all the other squares she had made and stitched them together. She smiled as she leafed through them. It would be Susan's first book. The next morning, Cora rushed to Aunt Alma's wagon. Susan was sleeping. Cora gave her a goodbye kiss on the forehead and turned to Aunt Alma. She wanted to tell Aunt Alma about the book, but she could do is push the cloth pages to her aunt's hands. Aunt Alma looked at each page and then wrapped her arms around Cora. I promise when Susan gets older, I'll give her this book and tell her the story about how she crossed the prairie, Aunt Alma said, and that she has a sister named Cora who loves her very much. The wagon train divided. Cora and Paul moved on, crossing the highest plain deserts and to the mountains, and weeks later finally reaching Oregon Territory. Soon Paul had built a home and then a farm. A town grew up and a school was built. Months passed into years. Cora did well in her studies, and 6 years after she left Missouri, she took a test to become a teacher. It wasn't long before she was offered a position. A minister and his wife would journey south to open a new church, and she would go with them to school teach. We have a few slates, but no books, the minister said as he showed Cora the schoolhouse. We've asked the students to bring any they have from home. They've brought my old readers, Cora replied, setting them on the desk beside the slates. She also pulled out a ledger, a bottle of ink, and a pen. Then the children arrived, and she asked them to line up in front of her desk. What's your name? Cora asked the first child. She carefully dipped her pen and wrote the name onto her ledger. She did the same with the two boys. The next child stood in front of her desk. And your name? Cora asked, looking up from the ledger. My name is Susan, and I have a book. And I picked this book because it was just always one of my favorite books in elementary.